In the exclusive world of Avaloire Valley, a billion-dollar empire builder stormed into a historic cathedral every Sunday, not to pray, but to publicly challenge God's existence in front of the entire congregation. Little did Calixta Renshaw know that her theatrical displays of defiance would lead to an encounter so extraordinary, it would shatter everything she believed was real. This is the story that's leaving millions questioning their own convictions. If this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button and notification bell because you won't want to miss what happens next in this extraordinary tale of pride, power, and divine intervention. The morning sun cast long shadows through the frost-covered windows of Helios Manor, a sprawling $20 million estate perched high in Vermont's most exclusive mountain community. Inside, Calixta Renshaw stood before her floor-to-ceiling mirror, adjusting the collar of her Balenciaga blazer with perfectly manicured fingers. Her reflection showed a woman in her 40s who had clawed her way to the summit of success, steel gray eyes that could make CEOs tremble, and a posture that radiated unshakable confidence. "Another Sunday, another chance to expose their delusions," she murmured, her lips curving into a smile that never quite reached her eyes. Her voice carried the crisp accent of old money, though everyone in Avaloire Valley knew she'd built her fortune from nothing. The grand hallway echoed with her Louboutin heels as she descended the marble staircase. Paintings worth millions adorned the walls. Not religious art, she'd made sure of that. Instead, contemporary pieces celebrated human achievement, technology, and power. Her power. "Zaharis," she called out to her husband, who was absorbed in his morning paper in the breakfast nook. "I'm heading to my weekly appointment." Her tone dripped with sarcasm. Zaharis Renshaw looked up, concern flickering across his features. "Calixta, perhaps it's time to..." "To what?" She cut him off, her voice sharp as a blade. "To stop exposing their fairy tales? To let them continue deceiving themselves?" She laughed, but it was a sound devoid of joy. "You know me better than that." He did know her better. He'd watched her build Renshaw Ventures from a small investment firm into a global empire. He'd seen her crush competitors who dared to stand in her way. But this weekly crusade against faith itself, this was different. This was personal. Outside, her matte black Aston Martin purred to life. The dashboard clock read 10:45 a.m. Perfect timing. She always arrived at the Cathedral of Sacred Light precisely 15 minutes after service began. It had become her signature entrance, a weekly performance that had turned her into both a local legend and a source of whispered prayers. As she drove through the winding roads of Avaloire Valley, the autumn leaves swirled around her car like nature's own confetti. The cathedral's spires came into view, its ancient stone walls standing defiant against the modern world. Calixta's grip tightened on the steering wheel. The parking lot was full, as usual. She pulled into her unofficial reserved spot, right next to Reverend Einar Thessaly's modest hybrid. The contrast between their vehicles never failed to amuse her. The Reverend preached about heavenly riches while driving a Prius. She had heaven's worth in her bank account. Inside the cathedral, Reverend Thessaly's voice carried through the ornate wooden doors. Right on cue, Calixta pushed them open, letting them swing wide with a dramatic boom that echoed through the vaulted ceiling. The congregation of Avaloire Valley's elite turned as one, a sea of designer suits and pearls, their faces a mixture of dread and fascination. Meridian Vale, the church's community leader, was helping with communion. She nearly dropped the sacred chalice at the sound of those doors. Even after months of these disruptions, the old woman's hand still trembled at Calixta's arrival. "Please, continue," Calixta announced, her voice carrying to every corner of the cathedral. "Don't let me interrupt your weekly exercise in wishful thinking." She moved down the center aisle with the confidence of a runway model, taking her usual seat in the front pew, a power move she'd perfected in countless boardrooms. Reverend Thessaly paused his sermon, his silver hair catching the light from the stained glass windows. Unlike others, he met Calixta's gaze directly. "Mrs. Renshaw," he acknowledged with a slight nod. "You're just in time. We were discussing faith in times of prosperity." "How convenient," Calixta replied, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Tell me, Reverend, how does your God explain the fact that I, who mock him weekly, am one of the most successful people in this valley? Where's the divine justice there?" The congregation held its collective breath. This was new. Usually, Calixta waited until the sermon's end to begin her challenges. Something was different today. There was an edge to her voice, a hint of something beyond her usual contempt. Her sister Isolde, seated in the far corner, closed her eyes in silent prayer. They hadn't spoken in years, not since their parents' funeral when Calixta had publicly rejected the family's faith. Now they only saw each other here, in this cathedral, where Calixta came to wage her weekly war against belief itself. The autumn wind whistled through a small gap in the ancient windows, creating an eerie undertone to the tense silence. Outside, storm clouds began gathering over Avaloire Valley, though no rain had been forecast. In the stillness of that moment, no one could have guessed that this Sunday would be different from all the others. That today something was about to change in a way that would shake not just Calixta's world, but the entire community of Avaloire Valley to its core. The Cathedral of Sacred Light fell into an uneasy silence as Reverend Thessaly stepped down from the pulpit, his weathered face serene despite the tension that crackled through the air. He moved with deliberate steps toward Calixta, his silver cross catching the light that filtered through the ancient stained glass windows. "Mrs. Renshaw," he spoke, his voice carrying a warmth that contrasted sharply with her cold demeanor. "Since you've chosen to join us early today, perhaps you'd be interested in a proposition." Calixta raised an elegantly arched eyebrow, her steel gray eyes narrowing with suspicion. This wasn't part of their usual dance. For months, she had interrupted services, and he had responded with patience. But this was different. A proposition? She let out a laugh that echoed off the cathedral's vaulted ceiling. "What could you possibly offer that would interest me, Reverend?" The congregation watched, transfixed. Among them, Perilous Drake, Calixta's business partner, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He'd never understood her obsession with challenging the church, but he'd learned long ago not to question the woman who had turned their investment firm into a billion-dollar empire. Reverend Thessaly smiled, a gentle expression that somehow made Calixta's skin prickle with unease. "The cathedral's restoration fund," he said, gesturing to the ancient walls around them. "We need exactly the amount you donated to the Children's Hospital last month, $2.7 million. Whispers rippled through the congregation. The Reverend had never been this direct, this bold. "If you fund the restoration," he continued, "I'll give you unlimited access to the cathedral for 1 week, 7 days to prove your point about the absence of faith. You can conduct any investigation you want, test any theory you have about our delusions, as you call them." Calixta's perfectly composed facade cracked for just a moment. This was unexpected, a challenge wrapped in an opportunity. Her mind, always calculating, began spinning through the possibilities. "And what makes you think I'd waste my time and money on your crumbling walls?" she asked, but there was a note of curiosity in her voice that hadn't been there before. "Because," Reverend Thessaly replied, "this cathedral holds secrets even you can't explain, Mrs. Renshaw. Secrets that have survived wars, plagues, and skeptics far more determined than yourself." From her corner, Isolde watched her sister's reaction intently. She recognized that look in Calixta's eyes, the same expression she'd worn before taking over her first company, before crushing her first competitor. "Fine," Calixta declared, rising to her feet. Her voice carried the authority of someone used to commanding boardrooms. "I'll play your game, Reverend. But when I prove this is all smoke and mirrors, you'll have to publicly acknowledge it, in front of your entire congregation." The Reverend nodded solemnly. "And if you find something that challenges your convictions? What then, Mrs. Renshaw?" Calixta's laugh was sharp enough to cut glass. "That won't happen. Have your lawyers draw up the agreement. I'll have my team review it tomorrow." She turned on her heel, preparing to make her usual dramatic exit, but Reverend Thessaly's voice stopped her. "One more thing," he called out. "The investigation must be conducted alone. No team, no employees, just you and these ancient walls." The congregation held its breath. Everyone knew Calixta Renshaw never worked alone. Her power came from commanding others, from delegating and directing. This stipulation changed everything. She turned back slowly, her expression unreadable. "You're asking the CEO of a global investment firm to spend a week playing ghost hunter in your cathedral? Alone?" "I'm asking you to face your challenges directly for once," he replied quietly. "No hiding behind wealth or influence, just you seeking your truth." Lightning flashed outside, illuminating the stained glass windows and casting kaleidoscope shadows across Calixta's face. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. In that brief moment of celestial light, something passed across her features. A flicker of uncertainty, perhaps even fear. "I'll do it," she announced, her voice harder than before. "But I'm bringing in my own equipment. If we're going to expose this facade, we'll do it properly." Leander Thaddeus, the family confidant who had known Calixta since childhood, watched from the shadow of a marble column. He alone noticed how her hand trembled slightly as she reached for her designer handbag. He alone saw the way her eyes darted to the crude wooden cross her mother had carried until her dying day, the one now mounted near the altar. As Calixta strode out of the cathedral, the heavy doors swinging shut behind her with a resonant boom, Cassiane Windermere, the church volunteer who had been arranging flowers near the altar, crossed herself quickly. "May God help her," she whispered, though whether it was a prayer for Calixta's soul or protection from what the woman might unleash, no one could say. Outside, the gathering storm finally broke. Rain pounded against the cathedral's ancient stones as Calixta's Aston Martin roared to life. Inside the car, she gripped the steering wheel until her knuckles turned white. Her mind already formulating plans, strategies, ways to prove she was right, had always been right. But as she drove through the sheets of rain, a small voice in the back of her mind whispered a dangerous question. What if she was wrong? Monday morning dawned with an unusual chill in Avaloire Valley. Calixta sat in her home office at Helios Manor, surrounded by 3 monitors displaying stock market data and corporate reports. But for the first time in years, her attention wasn't on the numbers. Instead, her eyes kept drifting to the contract from the Cathedral of Sacred Light, delivered by courier at dawn. "This is ridiculous," she muttered, reaching for her 3rd espresso of the morning. The legal document was straightforward enough. 7 days of unlimited access to the cathedral, starting the following Sunday. No teams, no assistants. Just her equipment, and whatever secrets Reverend Thessaly claimed the ancient building held. Her phone buzzed. Perched Drake's name flashed on the screen. "Calixta." His voice was tense when she answered. "Have you seen the markets today? Something strange is happening with our algorithmic trading systems." She quickly switched her focus to the center monitor, where red numbers flashed urgently. The proprietary trading algorithm she'd developed, the crown jewel of Renshaw Ventures, was behaving erratically. Instead of executing its usual perfect trades, it was flagging religious organizations and charities for investment. "That's impossible," she snapped, her fingers flying across the keyboard. "I wrote that code myself. There's no way it could—" She stopped mid-sentence, staring at the screen in disbelief. Every charity the algorithm had selected was connected to religious institutions. Even more unsettling, each one showed unprecedented growth potential, defying all logical market indicators. "Run a full diagnostic," she ordered Perched, "and get our tech team to—" The lights in her office flickered, and all 3 monitors went black. When they came back on seconds later, a single line of code scrolled across each screen. "Some things cannot be calculated." Calixta pushed back from her desk, her heart racing. The message disappeared as quickly as it had come, replaced by normal market data. But the trading algorithm was now functioning perfectly again, showing no trace of its earlier anomalies. "Perched, are you seeing this?" She spoke into the phone, but the line was dead. Outside her office window, storm clouds still lingered from yesterday, casting strange shadows across the manicured grounds of Helios Manor. As she watched, one of the shadows seemed to take the shape of a cross before dissolving back into formless darkness. A knock at her office door made her jump. "Enter," she called out, struggling to keep her voice steady. Zahari stepped in, holding a package. "This was just delivered for you," he said, placing it on her desk. "No sender address." The package was small, wrapped in brown paper and tied with simple twine. With slightly trembling fingers, Calixta untied the string. Inside was an old leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age. A note fell from between its pages. "You might find this interesting reading before your investigation begins. E.T. Einar Thessaly," she whispered, recognizing the Reverend's initials. Opening the journal, she found it was dated 1876, written by one of the cathedral's original architects. As she began to read, the office lights flickered again. This time, when they stabilized, something was different. The thermostat showed 72 degrees, but Calixta could see her breath in the air. She tried to call Zaharis back, but her voice seemed to stick in her throat. The journal's pages began turning on their own, settling on an entry marked "The Incident." The architect's handwriting was frantic, describing inexplicable events during the cathedral's construction, events that mirrored what was happening in her office right now. Calixta slammed the journal shut, her hands shaking. "This is absurd," she declared to the empty room. "Simple power fluctuations, old building wiring, nothing more." But even as she spoke, she noticed her reflection in the darkened computer screens, and for a moment, just a moment, she wasn't alone in the reflection. A figure stood behind her chair, indistinct but undeniably present. When she spun around, the office was empty, but the air held a lingering scent of incense, the same kind used in the cathedral's services. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was Cassiane Windermere, the church volunteer. "Mrs. Renshaw," her voice was hesitant. "Reverend Thessaly asked me to confirm you received the journal." "Yes," Calixta replied sharply. "And you can tell him his theatrical tricks aren't going to work. I don't know how he hacked our trading system or arranged these power fluctuations, but—" "Trading system?" Cassiane interrupted, confusion clear in her voice. "I'm not sure what you mean. The Reverend has been in silent prayer all morning. He hasn't left the cathedral since dawn." The implications of this statement hung in the air like the lingering scent of incense. If Reverend Thessaly hadn't orchestrated these events, then who, or what, had? "Mrs. Renshaw, are you still there?" Calixta's response was cut off by another power fluctuation. This time, when the lights came back on, every digital device in her office displayed the same message. 7 days until you understand." She quickly ended the call, her composed facade cracking further. The journal on her desk fell open again, this time to a detailed drawing of the cathedral's architecture. But something was wrong with the image. The more she stared at it, the more the lines seemed to move, forming patterns that made her head spin. A distant church bell tolled, though the cathedral was miles away. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, reverberating through her bones. As the last toll faded, Calixta realized she could no longer deny it. Something impossible was happening, and it was only the beginning. The rest of Monday passed in a blur of unexplainable incidents. By Tuesday morning, Calixta sat in her private conference room at Renshaw Ventures headquarters in the Empyrean district, surrounded by stacks of research about the Cathedral of Sacred Light. Dark circles under her eyes betrayed her sleepless night, though she'd expertly concealed them with expensive concealer. "Mrs. Renshaw?" Her executive assistant's voice crackled through the intercom. "Mr. Drake is here with the system diagnostics you requested." Calixta pressed the intercom button. "Send him in." She quickly closed the cathedral architect's journal, sliding it beneath a stack of quarterly reports. Paralis entered, his usually impeccable appearance slightly disheveled. "You're not going to believe this," he said, dropping a thick folder on the conference table. "Every test we've run shows our systems are functioning perfectly. No signs of hacking, no malware, no external interference. It's as if yesterday's anomalies never happened." "That's impossible," Calixta muttered, flipping through the diagnostic reports. "I saw it with my own eyes. Religious organizations don't suddenly become prime investment opportunities by... She stopped mid-sentence. There, in the middle of the technical report, was a series of numbers that made her blood run cold. The timestamp of each system anomaly perfectly matched the times of daily prayers at the cathedral. "Peerless," she said slowly. "What time did the first anomaly occur yesterday?" 6:15 a.m., he replied, consulting his notes. "Why?" Calixta's hands trembled slightly as she opened the cathedral's schedule she'd obtained. Morning prayers began at 6:15 a.m. The second anomaly? 12:30 p.m., midday prayer. The third? 6 p.m., evening prayer. Before she could process this revelation, every screen in the conference room flickered to life simultaneously. Instead of their usual financial data, they displayed images from security cameras throughout the building. But something was wrong with the footage. "That's impossible," Pyrelis whispered, moving closer to the nearest screen. In every frame, amid the usual business activity, transparent figures moved through the crowds of employees. They wore clothing from different eras: Victorian suits, 1920s dresses, modern business attire. But all of them were walking in the same direction, toward the cathedral. Calixta grabbed her phone to call security, but instead of her usual screen, she found a single image: the cathedral's architectural blueprint. As she watched, certain lines began to glow, forming a pattern she recognized from her studies of sacred geometry: the golden ratio. "Mrs. Renshaw?" Peerless's voice seemed distant. "Are you all right? You've gone pale." She blinked, and the screens returned to normal. But the pattern she'd seen remained burned in her memory. It was the same pattern she'd noticed in her company's stock charts during yesterday's anomalies. The same pattern that appeared in the architect's journal illustrations. "Cancel my meetings for the day," she ordered, gathering her things. "I need to verify something." The drive to the cathedral took exactly 12 minutes, the same number of times the strange figures had appeared on her security footage. Calixta parked in her usual spot, but this time, approaching the cathedral doors sent a shiver down her spine. Reverend Thessaly stood at the entrance, as if expecting her. "Back so soon, Mrs. Renshaw. Your investigation doesn't officially begin until Sunday." "Cut the act," she snapped, though her voice lacked its usual bite. "What did you do to my company's systems? How are you creating these patterns?" The Reverend's smile was gentle but knowing. "I've been here all morning, leading prayers. But it's interesting that you mention patterns. They say God speaks through them, you know. In nature, in mathematics, in the very fabric of reality." As if on cue, a shaft of sunlight broke through the clouds passing through the cathedral's rose window. The light fractured into countless beams, creating a complex geometric pattern on the ground between them. A pattern that exactly matched the one from her phone, from the security footage, from the journal. "This is a trick," Calixta insisted, but she couldn't look away from the light pattern. "An elaborate hoax." "Is it?" Reverend Thessaly gestured to the pattern. "Look closely, Mrs. Renshaw. These same patterns appear in your trading algorithms, don't they? In the very mathematics you use to build your fortune?" Calixta felt the ground shift beneath her feet, not physically, but in that deep existential way that comes with confronting something that challenges everything you believe. The pattern on the ground seemed to pulse with its own light now, independent of the sun above. "Your mother saw the patterns too," the Reverend added quietly. "Before she died, she spoke of them, of how they appeared in her dreams, guiding her." "Don't you dare speak of my mother," Calixta hissed, but the words caught in her throat as she noticed something else. The shadow she cast on the pattern matched exactly the silhouette in her office reflection yesterday, complete with the indistinct figure standing behind her. She spun around, but again, no one was there. When she turned back to confront the Reverend, he was gone. Only the pattern remained, still pulsing gently on the cathedral steps. With trembling fingers, Calixta pulled out her phone to photograph the pattern, to prove to herself it was just a trick of the light. But in the image on her screen, the pattern had transformed into words. "The numbers you trust are just echoes of divine order." As she stared at her phone, notifications began flooding in. Every financial news outlet was reporting the same story. Religious organizations and charities worldwide were experiencing unprecedented growth, defying all market logic. The pattern she'd dismissed yesterday wasn't an anomaly. It was spreading, growing, transforming the very markets she thought she understood. A warm breeze carried the scent of incense from the cathedral, and with it came a whispered question that seemed to echo in her very soul. Do you see the pattern now? By Wednesday morning, Calixta had transformed her home office into a war room of rationality. Multiple whiteboards covered the walls, filled with equations, market data, and attempted explanations for every inexplicable event of the past 3 days. 3 empty bottles of Chateau Lafite Rothschild, at $4,500 each, stood testament to her sleepless night. "It's mass hysteria," she declared to her reflection in the window, though her voice lacked its usual conviction. "Market manipulation on a global scale. It has to be." Behind her, Zaharis leaned against the doorframe, concern etched deep in his features. "Calixta," he said softly, "you haven't slept in 36 hours. Maybe it's time to—" "To what?" she snapped, spinning to face him. "Accept that invisible figures are appearing in our security footage? That centuries-old religious buildings are somehow affecting global financial markets?" She laughed, but the sound held an edge of hysteria. "I built this company on logic, on hard data. I won't let some ancient superstitions—" The lights flickered and every piece of technology in the room, phones, tablets, laptops, switched on simultaneously. Each screen displayed the same image, a black and white photograph from 1943, showing Calixta's grandmother standing on the cathedral steps. But unlike the copy hanging in their hallway, this version showed something else. A familiar pattern of light surrounding her grandmother, the same pattern that had appeared yesterday. "That's not possible," Calixta whispered, moving closer to the nearest screen. "This photo's been digitally altered. It's another trick." Her words were cut short by a notification ping. An email appeared on every screen, sender unknown. "Check your grandmother's diary. Page 127, November 15th, 1943. Calixta's hands trembled as she crossed to the family safe hidden behind an abstract painting worth millions. Inside, wrapped in silk, lay her grandmother's diary, a book she hadn't opened since inheriting it 15 years ago. Page 127 was marked with a pressed flower, its petals still holding a hint of color after 8 decades. Her grandmother's elegant handwriting filled the page. "Today I saw the truth in the cathedral. The patterns of light, the mathematics of the divine. It's all real. The answers we seek in commerce and industry are mere shadows of a greater order. I pray my children, and their children after them, will see what I have seen." "This proves nothing," Calixta insisted, but her voice cracked. "Anyone could have written this. Anyone could have—" The diary's pages began turning on their own, settling on an entry from the day Calixta was born. A detailed drawing covered the page, the exact pattern that had been haunting her for days. From somewhere in the house, music began playing, not from their state-of-the-art sound system, but from her mother's old music box, a family heirloom she'd locked away in the attic after her parents' death. The melody drifted through the air conditioning vents, a hymn her mother used to sing. Enough. Calixta slammed the diary shut, her carefully maintained composure finally cracking. "I don't know how you're doing this, Reverend, but it ends now." She stormed toward her private elevator, ignoring Zaharis's protests. The rational part of her mind screamed that driving to the cathedral now, 3 days before her official investigation, was playing into their hands. But rationality was feeling increasingly irrelevant. The drive to the cathedral was surreal. Every digital billboard she passed displayed fragments of her grandmother's diary entry. Every radio station played that same hymn. Even her car's navigation system seemed possessed, the route map forming that same divine pattern over and over. She screeched to a halt in front of the cathedral, but the sight that greeted her made her blood run cold. The building was dark, locked. A simple sign on the door read, "Closed for private prayer until Sunday." "Private prayer?" she scoffed, reaching for her phone to call Reverend Thessaly. But instead of her contact list, her phone displayed a series of photographs. Her own face, taken at different ages, always in front of the cathedral. Photos she knew couldn't exist because she'd never posed for them. The final image made her drop the phone in shock. It showed her, as she looked right now, standing on the cathedral steps. But this photo was dated 1943, showing her next to her grandmother. "This isn't real," she whispered, backing away from the cathedral. "None of this is real." But as she turned to flee, she caught her reflection in her car's window. For a split second, she saw herself as she appeared in that impossible photograph, standing beside her grandmother, both of them surrounded by that divine pattern of light. The drive home was a blur. When she finally reached her office, she found Leander Thaddeus waiting, holding a stack of papers. "Your grandmother's original market analyses," he said without preamble. "The ones she used to build the family's first fortune. I thought you should see these now." Calixta snatched the papers, her eyes widening as she studied the yellowed documents. Every successful trade, every market prediction her grandmother had made was based on patterns, the same patterns she'd been seeing everywhere. "She wasn't just following market trends," Leander said quietly. "She was following something deeper, something your mother understood too before the end." "Get out," Calixta whispered, her voice dangerous. "Get out." Alone in her office, she began tearing down the whiteboards, erasing her rational explanations with shaking hands. But as the equations disappeared, new patterns emerged in the smeared ink, divine geometry hiding beneath her desperate attempts at logic. Her phone buzzed one final time. A text message from an unknown number. "You can't erase what's written in your soul. See you Sunday." The message was signed with a single symbol, the same pattern that had started it all. The one she now realized she'd been seeing her entire life, in everything from stock charts to childhood dreams. For the first time since she was a little girl, Calixta Renshaw, the woman who had built an empire on cold logic and harder data, felt tears running down her cheeks. Thursday arrived with an oppressive weight in the air. Calixta hadn't left Helios Manor since her disturbing encounter at the cathedral the previous day. The mansion's security system had been upgraded, every entrance monitored, every window secured. Yet somehow, the scent of incense still permeated every room. "The board is demanding answers," Peralez's voice crackled through her secure line, the only phone she still trusted. "Religious organizations worldwide are outperforming tech stocks. Our algorithms are going haywire. The financial press is calling it the divine market shift." Calixta stood at her office window, watching storm clouds gather over Avaloire Valley for the fourth consecutive day. "Cancel the board meeting," she ordered. "Cite personal emergency. I need time to—" Her words cut off as she noticed something in the garden below. The elaborate topiaries, meticulously maintained in geometric patterns, had somehow reshaped themselves overnight. From her vantage point, they now formed an exact replica of the cathedral's floor plan. "Time to what?" Peralez pressed. "Calixta, rumors are spreading. People are saying you've had some kind of religious experience, that you're behind these market anomalies." She laughed sharply, but the sound died in her throat as she saw her reflection in the window. For a moment, just a moment, she was wearing her mother's crucifix, the one she'd buried with her years ago. "I'll handle it," she snapped, ending the call. But as she turned from the window, every screen in her office blazed to life, displaying the same message. "You can't handle what's coming." The words pulsed with that now familiar pattern, the one she'd seen in her grandmother's trading charts in the cathedral's architecture, in her own company's success graph. It was everywhere now, impossible to ignore. A knock at her office door made her jump. "What?" she barked. Isolde stepped in looking exactly like their mother in that moment. "We need to talk, sister." "How did you get past security?" Calixta demanded, reaching for her phone to call the guards. "The same way I've been trying to reach you for years," Isolde replied quietly. "Through prayer." The phone in Calixta's hand grew impossibly hot. She dropped it, watching in disbelief as its screen displayed a video, herself as a child, kneeling beside their mother in prayer. But this wasn't a memory she recognized. "That never happened," she whispered. "It did." Isolde moved closer. "But you chose to forget. Just like you chose to forget what happened the day Mother died." The air in the office grew thick, heavy with unseen presence. The video on the phone changed, showing their mother's hospital room. But this version showed something the security cameras had missed: the pattern of light that had filled the room in her final moments, the same pattern that now haunted Calixta. "You saw it then," Isolde continued. "We both did. But you couldn't accept it. You built all this." She gestured to the office, the empire beyond, to prove it wasn't real, to prove you didn't need faith. "Get out," Calixta's voice shook. "Get out." But as Isolde turned to leave, she placed something on the desk, their mother's prayer journal. "Read it," she said simply. "Before Sunday." Alone again, Calixta stared at the journal as if it might bite her. Minutes ticked by. Finally, with trembling fingers, she opened it to the last entry, dated the day of their mother's death. "Calixta will see the truth when she's ready. The patterns have always been there, guiding her even when she denied them. Her grandmother saw them in the markets. I see them in the light, and soon she'll see them too. God's mathematics are written in her soul, just as they were written in mine." The journal slipped from her fingers, but instead of falling, it hung suspended in midair. Its pages began turning rapidly, and in the margins of every page that pattern emerged, glowing with its own light. Calixta backed away, bumping into her desk. Her computer screens flickered to life, displaying security footage from every camera in the mansion. In each feed, transparent figures moved through the halls, generations of her family, all walking toward her office, all surrounded by that same divine light. "This isn't happening," she whispered, pressing herself against the wall. "This can't be happening." But the figures kept coming, converging on her office. The scent of incense grew stronger, and the temperature dropped until she could see her breath in the air. The pattern now glowed on every surface: walls, ceiling, floor, turning her sanctuary of logic into a cathedral of light. Her mother's voice clear as day. "It's time to remember, daughter." Her grandmother's voice. The patterns never lied. More voices joined them, ancestors she'd never known, all speaking at once, their words weaving through the air like threads of light. The pattern grew brighter, more insistent, until it was all she could see. Then, suddenly, silence. When her vision cleared, Calixta found herself alone in her office. But everything had changed. The screens showed normal market data again, but now she could see it. The divine pattern underlying every trend, every fluctuation. It had always been there. Her phone rang. "Reverend Thessaly." "3 days until your investigation begins," he said without preamble. "Are you ready to face what you've been running from?" Before she could answer, every electronic device in the room displayed the same image: the cathedral at dawn, its windows blazing with that familiar pattern of light. Below the image, words appeared. "Your empire was built on foundations you denied. Sunday, you'll understand why." The lights went out, plunging her into darkness. When they returned seconds later, she found herself standing in front of the family portrait she'd commissioned last year. But the painting had changed. Now, behind each family member, spanning generations, that pattern of divine light shone clearly, a heritage of faith she'd spent her life denying. In that moment, Calixta Renshaw realized she'd reached a point of no return. The carefully constructed walls of her rational world weren't just cracking, they were being demolished by forces she could no longer deny. Sunday's investigation would not be about proving her point. It would be about facing the truth that had been pursuing her all along. Friday morning arrived with an unexpected visitor to Helios Manor. Leander Thaddeus stood at the front door, clutching a weathered leather briefcase that Calixta recognized from her childhood, her mother's private document case. "Your mother made me promise," he said without preamble as Calixta reluctantly let him in. If you ever started seeing the patterns, I was to give you this. The grand foyer of Helios Manor seemed to hold its breath as Leander placed the briefcase on an antique table worth more than most cars. The crystal chandelier above them dimmed slightly, though no one had touched the controls. How did you know? Calixta's voice was barely a whisper. About the patterns? Leander's weathered face softened. I was there the day your grandmother first discovered them. March 15th, 1943. The day the cathedral's renovation revealed something extraordinary. He opened the briefcase with reverent care. Inside, yellowed newspapers chronicled a strange occurrence during the cathedral's reconstruction. Workers had uncovered a hidden chamber beneath the altar, containing documents that dated back to the building's original construction. Your grandmother was the only one who could decode them, Leander continued, spreading the papers across the table. Because she saw the pattern, the same one you're seeing now. Calixta's hands trembled as she examined the documents. Complex mathematical equations covered the pages, interwoven with religious symbols. But it was the handwriting that made her blood run cold. It matched her own perfectly. That's impossible, she breathed. These are centuries old. Look closer, Leander urged. Read the name at the bottom. There, in faded ink. Calixta Renshaw, 1847. I don't understand, she said, but even as the words left her mouth, the papers began to glow with that now familiar pattern. Images flooded her mind, memories that couldn't be hers, yet felt more real than her own. A woman in Victorian dress, standing before the cathedral's foundation stones. Her face, Calixta's face, deep in concentration as she mapped divine patterns in the architecture. The same patterns that would emerge in market trends a century later, guiding her grandmother's investments. Your name isn't a coincidence, Leander said softly. Your mother knew. She saw the connection the moment you were born. Why do you think she insisted on that name? The chandelier's crystals began chiming softly, though there was no breeze. Each note corresponded perfectly to the mathematical frequencies detailed in the ancient documents. You're saying I'm... what? Some kind of reincarnation? Calixta's laugh held a note of hysteria. That's ridiculous. I built my empire on logic, on data. On patterns you understood instinctively, Leander interrupted. Patterns that your ancestor, your previous self, helped embed in the cathedral's very foundations. Why do you think you've been so drawn to it? Why do you think you fought so hard against its influence? As if in response, every mirror in the foyer suddenly reflected a different version of Calixta. Herself in Victorian dress, herself in her grandmother's era, herself now. All showing the same expression of dawning recognition. The cathedral's restoration fund, she whispered. The amount Reverend Thessaly requested in $2.7 million. The exact amount your previous self calculated would be needed, detailed in these documents, Leander confirmed. The number's been waiting for you, hidden in plain sight, for over 150 years. Calixta sank into a nearby chair, her legs no longer able to support her. The papers on the table began organizing themselves, forming the same pattern she'd seen everywhere, the pattern she now realized she had helped create in a previous life. Your mother spent years preparing for this moment, Leander continued, pulling out one final document. She knew you'd fight it, knew you'd build walls of logic and reason. But she also knew the patterns would eventually call you home. The document was a letter, written in her mother's hand, dated the day before she died. My dearest Calixta, by the time you read this, you'll have begun to see what I've always seen in you. The echo of a soul that has danced with divine mathematics across centuries. Your resistance, your empire building, your weekly challenges at the cathedral, all of it has been leading you back to who you truly are. The patterns you see aren't just mathematical formulas or market trends. They're the language of faith written in numbers, a bridge between the rational and the divine that you yourself helped design in another life. The cathedral needs you now, just as it needed you then. The restoration isn't just about fixing ancient stones. It's about restoring the connection you forged between heaven and earth, between logic and faith. You'll fight this truth. Your brilliant mind will seek every rational explanation. But deep in your soul, in the part of you that has lived before and will live again, you already know. The patterns are calling you home, daughter, with eternal love, Mother. As Calixta finished reading, the letter began to glow with that familiar light. The pattern emerged between the lines of text, but this time she didn't fight it. For the first time, she let herself feel the deep resonance between the mathematics she'd mastered and the divine geometry she'd helped create so long ago. The chandelier's light caught the tears rolling down her cheeks, each droplet reflecting the pattern that had haunted her across lifetimes. In the distance, the cathedral bells began to toll, though it wasn't any regular prayer time. "Sunday," she said quietly. "I'm not just investigating the cathedral, am I?" Leander shook his head. "You're returning to it. The question is, are you ready to remember everything you once knew? Everything you've been running from?" The papers on the table glowed brighter, and in their light, Calixta saw herself as she truly was. A soul that had woven divine mathematics into earthly architecture, now called back to complete a work begun over a century ago. Sunday was no longer a challenge to be won. It was a homecoming centuries in the making. Saturday night descended on Avaloire Valley like a heavy velvet curtain. Calixta sat alone in her home office, surrounded by 150 years of evidence she could no longer deny. The Victorian documents, her grandmother's trading charts, her mother's letters, all illuminated by that persistent divine pattern that now seemed to follow her everywhere. "Mrs. Renshaw?" Her security chief's voice crackled through the intercom. "There's something you need to see." On her security monitors, every camera around Helios Manor showed the same inexplicable sight. Hundreds of transparent figures walking toward the cathedral, each glowing with that familiar pattern of light. Some wore clothes from centuries past, others from more recent decades, all moving with singular purpose. "Ma'am," the security chief's voice shook slightly. "Facial recognition is identifying some of these figures as your ancestors." Calixta watched as the spectral procession grew larger. Among them, she recognized faces from the family portraits that lined her halls. Great-grandparents, distant cousins, relatives she'd never met, but whose blood ran through her veins. All of them, across generations, connected by that same divine geometry she'd helped create in 1847. Her phone rang. Reverend Thessaly. "They're gathering," he said without preamble. "Just as they did in 1847 when you first embedded the patterns in the cathedral's foundations. Just as they did in 1943, when your grandmother rediscovered them. The veil between worlds thins when the patterns align." "This isn't possible," Calixta whispered, but her protest sounded hollow even to her own ears. "You engineered this possibility yourself in your previous life," the Reverend replied. "The mathematics you wove into the cathedral's architecture wasn't just about structure. It was about creating a bridge between the rational and the divine. Tomorrow that bridge will be complete again." As if in response to his words, every electronic device in her office began displaying the same cascading series of numbers. The mathematical sequence she'd been seeing in her dreams, the one that underpinned her company's success, the one she now recognized from her work in 1847. "But why?" she demanded. "Why all this? Why me?" "Because some truths need to be rediscovered in every age," Reverend Thessaly answered. "In 1847, you used mathematics to prove the existence of divine order. Your grandmother used those same patterns to build wealth that could support the church's mission. And now what? Now it's time for you to bridge the gap between faith and reason for a new generation. The patterns you've embedded in modern financial systems, the algorithms you've created, they're all echoes of what you began in 1847. Tomorrow, the circle closes." The security feed suddenly shifted, showing the cathedral. Its windows blazed with light despite the late hour, and that familiar pattern pulsed through the stained glass like a heartbeat. "They're waiting for you," the Reverend said softly. "All of them. The question is, are you ready to remember who you really are?" Before Calixta could respond, Every mirror in her office reflected a different version of herself. The Victorian mathematician, the modern CEO, and something else. Something between worlds that had always been there, waiting to be acknowledged. The patterns around her grew stronger, brighter, until they formed a web of light that connected everything, past and present, logic and faith, doubt and certainty. In that illuminated moment, memories began flooding back. Calculations made by candlelight in 1847, prayers whispered in ancient halls, divine mathematics woven into stone and glass. Her computer screens displayed a final message. The bridge between worlds was never lost. It was waiting for you to remember how to cross it. The message was signed with a symbol she'd last drawn in 1847, the key to the mathematical proof of divine order, hidden in the cathedral's architecture, waiting to be rediscovered. Suddenly, the power went out across Helios Manor. But in the darkness, Calixta could still see. The patterns glowed with their own light, showing her a path she'd walked before, in another life, in another time. Her phone lit up one last time with a text from an unknown number. Tomorrow at dawn. The circle completes, the patterns return, the bridge reopens. Are you ready to remember everything? The message was signed with her own initials, not from now, but from 1847. In the darkness of her office, surrounded by the glowing echoes of a life she'd lived before, Calixta Renshaw finally understood. Her weekly attacks on faith, her empire built on cold logic, her desperate need to deny the divine, it had all been leading her back to this moment, back to the truth she'd helped write into the universe itself. Tomorrow's investigation wouldn't just be about entering the cathedral. It would be about crossing a bridge she'd built across centuries, about remembering a truth she'd never really forgotten. The patterns pulsed around her one final time, and in their light, she saw what awaited her at dawn, a convergence of past and present, of faith and reason, of all the lives she'd lived, and the one truth that connected them all. I remember, she whispered to the darkness. I remember everything. And in the distance, the cathedral bells began to toll, calling her home. Dawn broke over Avaloire Valley in shafts of golden light that seemed to pulse with that now familiar pattern. Calixta stood before the cathedral's great doors, no longer the arrogant CEO who had mockingly disrupted services, but a woman transformed by the weight of remembrance. The global financial markets had opened hours ago in Asia, and her phone hadn't stopped buzzing with notifications. Something unprecedented was happening. Every market, every exchange, every trading algorithm was moving in perfect harmony with the mathematical patterns she'd embedded in the cathedral's architecture centuries ago. The divine algorithm, Piralis's voice shook as he read the latest reports over the phone. That's what they're calling it. Every financial system in the world is displaying the same mathematical sequence. Your sequence, Calixta, the one you've been seeing everywhere. She ended the call, watching as the morning light struck the cathedral's rose window. The pattern exploded into brilliant color, exactly as she had designed it to do in 1847. The mathematics of faith, written in light and glass, now mirrored in the digital heartbeat of global finance. They're all here, Reverend Thessaly said softly, appearing beside her. Every soul who ever helped maintain this bridge between worlds. Look. Around them, the air shimmered with presence. Transparent figures materialized. Architects, mathematicians, priests, and financial pioneers across centuries, all connected by the divine patterns she had woven into reality itself. Among them, she recognized her grandmother, her mother, and even herself from 1847, all nodding in silent acknowledgement. The markets aren't just reflecting the pattern, she whispered, understanding flooding through her. They're resonating with it. The algorithms I created for Renshaw Ventures, they weren't just about profit, they were remembering. My soul was remembering. Inside the cathedral, every candle ignited simultaneously, though no human hand had touched them. The morning light through the stained glass windows created complex intersecting patterns on the floor, the same patterns now appearing on trading screens worldwide. Her phone displayed a message from the World Financial Authority. Global markets experiencing unprecedented harmony. All systems aligned with previously unknown mathematical sequence. Source: Renshaw Ventures algorithms. Please explain. But how could she explain that the world's financial systems were dancing to the rhythm of divine mathematics she had encoded into a cathedral's architecture over 150 years ago? News crews began arriving, drawn by the spectacular light show emanating from the cathedral's windows. The pattern was visible now even to digital cameras spreading across social media, capturing the world's attention. "Mrs. Renshaw," reporters called out, "can you explain the connection between your trading algorithms and this phenomenon?" Before she could respond, every electronic device in the vicinity, phones, cameras, microphones, displayed the same message. The mathematics of faith were never lost. They were waiting to be remembered. The message was signed with both her current signature and her signature from 1847, identical, separated by centuries, but united by purpose. Isolde emerged from the growing crowd, tears streaming down her face. "You remember now, don't you? What Mother tried to tell us? What's been true all along?" Calixta nodded, her own eyes filling with tears. The patterns around them grew stronger, brighter, until they formed a bridge of light connecting the cathedral's ancient stones to the modern devices displaying their digital echo. From inside her purse, her mother's old prayer journal began to glow. Opening it, she found a new entry appearing in her mother's handwriting. "The circle completes. The bridge stands renewed. The patterns flow again. Well done, my daughter." Global news networks were broadcasting live now, showing how financial centers worldwide were being transformed by the divine algorithm. Traders watched in awe as markets moved with unprecedented harmony, guided by patterns that had waited centuries to be remembered. "Your weekly protests," Reverend Thessaly said gently, "they were never really against faith. They were your soul's way of fighting to remember, of demanding to understand what you once knew so well." Calixta stepped forward, facing the assembled cameras and reporters. The pattern of light surrounded her, connecting past and present, faith and reason, divine order and human understanding. "I built my empire on mathematics," she began, her voice carrying clearly across the square. "But I never understood where those patterns came from, not until now. What you're seeing in the global markets, what you're seeing here, it's the same truth, written in different languages across time." The cathedral bells began to toll, each note corresponding perfectly to the mathematical frequencies now resonating through the world's financial systems. The crowd watched in wonder as the pattern of light grew stronger, forming a visible bridge between the ancient building and the modern world beyond. In that moment, Calixta Renshaw, who had once mocked faith with such bitter certainty, became living proof of something far greater: the eternal dance between divine order and human understanding, between faith and reason, between past and present. Her phone displayed one final message, simultaneously appearing on every screen in the square. "The patterns of faith flow through all things. Some of us are chosen to help others see them. Welcome home." The message was signed with the mathematical formula she had derived in 1847, the same formula now transforming the global financial markets, proving that divine order had been hiding in plain sight all along, waiting for humanity to remember how to see it. 1 month after the extraordinary events at the Cathedral of Sacred Light, Helios Manor had undergone a transformation as profound as its owners. The stark modern art that once adorned its walls had been replaced with complex geometric designs that seemed to pulse with inner light. The conference room where Calixta had once plotted market takeovers had become a research center dedicated to understanding the intersection of faith and mathematics. "The Renshaw Institute for Divine Mathematics," Calixta announced to the assembled crowd of journalists, academics, and religious leaders. The former CEO stood at a podium in her redesigned Great Hall, where that familiar pattern now flowed through every architectural detail. "For centuries, humanity has treated faith and reason as opposing forces," she continued, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had walked both paths. "But the patterns I rediscovered, the ones I first encoded into the cathedral's architecture in 1847, prove they are two expressions of the same divine truth. Behind her, massive screens displayed real-time market data, overlaid with the cathedral's architectural plans. The correlation was undeniable. Every major market movement followed the mathematical sequences she had embedded in the building's design over 150 years ago. Renshaw Ventures will continue its operations, she explained, but with a new mission. Our algorithms, now aligned with these sacred equations, will prioritize investments that bridge the gap between spiritual and material progress. The announcement was being broadcast globally, and on a secondary screen, Calixta could see the immediate impact. Markets worldwide were responding to her words, moving in harmony with the patterns that now seemed to flow through all things. Peralez Drake, who had witnessed her transformation from skeptic to bridge builder, stepped forward with the first quarterly report of the new era. Our reformed trading strategies, based on Mrs. Renshaw's sacred mathematics, have generated unprecedented returns. But more importantly, they've created a new kind of market stability, one based on divine harmony rather than human greed. As if in response to his words, the patterns visible in the market data began to pulse in sync with the geometric designs throughout the room. The assembled crowd gasped as the connection between abstract financial data and sacred geometry became visible to all. But this is just the beginning, Calixta continued, moving to a large covered object in the center of the room. Today we're launching something even more important. She pulled away the covering to reveal a complex three-dimensional model of the cathedral, each element inscribed with mathematical formulas that seemed to glow from within. The cathedral restoration project will do more than simply repair an ancient building. It will reactivate the full potential of the patterns I encoded there in 1847. The model began to project holographic representations of the divine patterns into the air above it, creating a virtual bridge between heaven and earth that matched exactly what she had designed in her previous life. Each of you received a prospectus. She gestured to the documents before them. But these aren't just financial projections. They're proof that the mathematics of faith can be understood and applied in our modern world. The proposals detailed an ambitious plan, a global network of research centers, each built according to the same sacred geometry as the cathedral. Financial technology that would embed divine patterns into economic systems worldwide. Educational programs teaching the mathematics of faith to new generations. My weekly protests at the cathedral were never really about denying God, she admitted, her voice softening. They were my soul's desperate attempt to remember what it once knew, that faith and reason are not opponents, but partners in understanding divine truth. As she spoke, the patterns around them grew stronger, more visible. Even the skeptical journalists in the crowd couldn't deny what their cameras were recording. Tangible evidence of mathematical principles that transcended normal physical laws. The divine algorithm isn't just a market phenomenon, she explained, bringing up new data on the screens. It's a key to understanding how spiritual truth expresses itself through mathematical order. The same patterns appear in nature, in music, in the movement of planets, and yes, in global finance. Leander Thaddeus, who had helped her rediscover her true identity, stepped forward with another announcement. The Renshaw Fellowship Program will sponsor mathematicians, theologians, and financial experts who wish to study these principles. We're not just building bridges between faith and reason, we're training others to maintain and expand them. The air in the room grew thick with that now familiar sense of presence. Those sensitive to such things could see them, figures from across time, gathering to witness this new chapter in the story they had helped write. My grandmother saw these patterns in market trends, Calixta continued. My mother saw them in daily life. I encoded them into financial algorithms without understanding their true significance. But now, we have the technology and understanding to fully realize what was started in 1847. She turned to the cathedral model, which now projected a complex web of light connecting it to financial centers worldwide. This is no longer about one building, one company, or one soul's journey across time. It's about remembering what humanity once knew, that divine order underlies all things, waiting to be recognized, waiting to be applied. The patterns around them pulsed one final time, and every screen in the room displayed the same message. The mathematics of faith flow through all creation. Some are chosen to help others understand them. Some must live many lives to remember them. But all are part of their eternal dance. The message was signed with 3 versions of her name, from 1847, from today, and from a future yet to come, proving that some truths transcend time itself. 6 months after the inauguration of the Renshaw Institute, Calixta stood in the cathedral's newly restored bell tower, watching the sunset paint the sky in colors that seemed to pulse with that now familiar divine pattern. Below, in the cathedral's renovated south wing, a unique gathering was taking place. "You're saying these market patterns just appeared to you?" A young quantitative analyst from Wall Street leaned forward, her skepticism reminiscent of Calixta's former self. Around her sat others like her, brilliant minds who had built careers on pure logic, now confronting evidence they couldn't explain. "Not appeared," Calixta corrected gently. "Remembered, just as you're beginning to remember them now." The analysts' trading algorithms had started displaying the same sacred geometry that Calixta had encoded into the cathedral. She wasn't alone. Across the globe, mathematicians, scientists, and financial experts were discovering these patterns in their work, drawn to Avaloire Valley by an intuition they couldn't explain. "But how can we be sure?" Another participant spoke up, a tech prodigy who had made billions in cryptocurrency. "How do we know these patterns aren't just coincidences?" Calixta smiled, pressing a button on her tablet. The cathedral's new digital mapping system activated, projecting the mathematical sequences onto the ancient stones. The patterns she had inscribed in 1847 aligned perfectly with the algorithms these young geniuses had independently developed in the modern era. "Because truth echoes through time," she explained. "The same patterns I wove into these walls in another life are appearing in your work now. Not because you copied them, but because your souls remember them too." The cathedral's restoration had revealed more than just architectural beauty. Hidden chambers had contained documents predicting this very gathering. Brilliant minds from future generations who would rediscover the mathematics of faith through their own work. "Each of you," Calixta continued, "has created something that aligns with divine order. Your trading algorithms, your quantum computations, your blockchain systems, they all reflect the same sacred geometry, not by chance, but by design. A design your souls remember." As if in response, their laptops and tablets began displaying cascading sequences of numbers, each person's work harmonizing with the others, creating a symphony of mathematical truth that made the air itself vibrate with energy. "The Renshaw Fellowship isn't just about studying these patterns," she explained. "It's about helping others remember them. Each of you will guide the next generation, just as those before us preserved these truths for our discovery." Isolde entered the room, carrying their mother's prayer journal. But now, similar journals sat before each participant, blank books waiting to be filled with new insights into eternal truths. "My weekly protests here weren't just acts of defiance," Calixta admitted. "They were expressions of a soul desperate to remember its purpose. Each of you has felt that same desperation, the sense that your analytical work was reaching for something beyond pure mathematics." The young analysts exchanged glances, seeing their own journeys reflected in her words. Many had struggled with spiritual questions despite their rational backgrounds, feeling drawn to mysteries their equations couldn't quite explain. "Your algorithms aren't just tools for generating wealth," she continued. "They're bridges between heaven and earth, just like this cathedral. The divine patterns flow through all creation, through architecture, through finance, through technology. Our role is to help others see them." She gestured to the cathedral's walls, where the projected patterns now moved in perfect harmony with the market data displayed on their screens. "This is why the Cathedral of Sacred Light was built, not just as a place of worship, but as a mathematical proof of divine order. A proof I helped create in 1847, that my grandmother rediscovered in 1943, and that you're all helping to understand today." One of the participants, a quantum physicist, suddenly stood up. "The entanglement patterns in my research," she whispered. "They're identical to these sequences. I thought I was going crazy, seeing religious symbols in quantum data." "You weren't crazy," Calixta assured her. "You were remembering, just as I remembered, just as others will remember after us." The air in the cathedral grew thick with presence, not just the usual spiritual energy, but the weighted potential of future discoveries. The patterns around them seemed to pulse with possibilities, showing glimpses of innovations yet to come. "This is your sanctuary now too," Calixta declared. "Not just for prayer, but for understanding. The mathematics you're developing will help others bridge the gap between faith and reason, between spiritual truth and scientific progress." She unveiled a series of new architectural plans, expansions to the cathedral that would incorporate advanced research facilities while maintaining its sacred geometry. The divine patterns would flow through both ancient stones and quantum computers, proving their eternal relevance. "Some will call this coincidence," she acknowledged. "Others will call it miraculous. But we know it's something else. The mathematics of faith expressing itself through human consciousness, generation after generation." As she spoke, the patterns around them grew stronger, brighter, until the cathedral itself seemed to pulse with living light. On their screens, global market data danced in perfect harmony with these ancient rhythms, proving that divine order spoke through all languages, including the digital ones of the modern age. "Your presence here isn't an accident," Calixta concluded. "Just as my protests weren't really about denial, your breakthrough algorithms aren't just about profit. They're about remembering what your souls have always known, that the bridge between heaven and earth is built on mathematics angels themselves would recognize." The gathered analysts watched in wonder as their own work, displayed on screens throughout the cathedral, aligned perfectly with the patterns Calixta had encoded into the architecture centuries before. They were part of something greater than themselves, a continuous revelation of divine truth through human understanding. In that moment, Calixta saw the future clearly. Generations of brilliant minds drawn to this sacred space, each adding their own insights to humanity's understanding of divine mathematics. The bridge she had helped build in 1847 would continue growing, evolving, reaching ever higher through the contributions of souls yet to be born. 1 year to the day after Calixta's first supernatural encounter, the Cathedral of Sacred Light hosted a ceremony unlike any in its history. The once proud CEO who had mockingly disrupted services now stood before a packed congregation, her presence radiating a peace that seemed to make the air itself glow with that familiar pattern. "A year ago, I stood in this very spot, challenging God's existence," she began, her voice carrying to every corner of the restored cathedral. "Today, I stand here as living proof that the divide between faith and reason was always an illusion, one that each soul must learn to see through in its own time." The cathedral's renovation was complete, but it was more than just a restoration. Every architectural element now visibly channeled the sacred mathematics she had encoded there in 1847. Modern technology merged seamlessly with ancient geometry, creating a space where divine patterns flowed freely between worlds. "The Renshaw Institute has documented over 10,000 cases worldwide," she continued, gesturing to the data displayed on subtle screens integrated into the restored architecture. "Scientists, mathematicians, and financial experts are rediscovering these patterns in their work. The bridge between heaven and earth grows stronger with each new understanding." In the front pew, Zahari sat with tears in his eyes, watching his wife complete a journey that had transformed not just her, but their entire world. Beside him, Isolde held their mother's prayer journal, its pages now continued by a new generation of seekers. "Our weekly meditation sessions now host quantum physicists alongside priests," Calixta smiled. "Because the mathematics of faith speak all languages, from ancient prayer to string theory, from sacred geometry to market algorithms." The patterns around her pulsed gently, visible now to everyone in the cathedral. What had once seemed supernatural had become a recognized phenomenon, studied by universities worldwide. The divine algorithm that had shocked global markets was now a standard part of financial theory, though its deeper implications remained a source of endless fascination. But this was never about proving anything, she admitted, her voice softening. It was about remembering what our souls have always known, that the order we seek to understand through science is the same order that moves through our spirits when we pray. Above them, the restored rose window caught the morning light, projecting complex mathematical sequences that matched perfectly with the market data displayed on the subtle screens. The same patterns appeared in everything from DNA structures to galaxy formations, proving that divine order spoke through all creation. A year ago, I demanded evidence, she continued, touching the cross she now wore, her mother's, found in a hidden chamber during the renovation. But the evidence had always been here, written in mathematics angels would recognize, waiting for humanity to remember how to read it. The air grew thick with that familiar presence as she spoke. Those gathered could see them now, figures from across time, ancestors and descendants, all connected by their role in maintaining this bridge between worlds. The weekly services I once interrupted with mockery now host global conferences, she smiled. Scientists present papers beside theological discussions. Market analysts study sacred geometry. Because truth doesn't choose sides, it embraces all sincere seeking. As if in response, every screen in the cathedral displayed the same message. The patterns flow eternal, through stone and silicon, through prayer and equation, through past and future, through all souls who remember. The message was signed with a mathematical formula that combined quantum mechanics with sacred geometry, a new discovery from the Renshaw Institute that proved divine order operated at every level of reality. My journey from skeptic to bridge builder wasn't unique, Calixta concluded. It's a path many souls walk, lifetime after lifetime, helping humanity remember its divine heritage through whatever language each age speaks best. She gestured to the young analysts and researchers seated throughout the congregation. For some, that language is mathematics. For others, prayer. For many now, it's the elegant algorithms that reveal divine order in the midst of chaos. All are valid. All are needed. All are true. The patterns around them grew stronger, brighter, until the cathedral itself seemed to pulse with living light. But now no one was afraid. What had once seemed supernatural had become a recognized gateway between human understanding and divine truth. The sacred equations remain constant, she smiled. Only our ability to comprehend them evolves. And so we continue, building bridges, remembering truth, helping others see what their souls have never forgotten. As she finished speaking, the cathedral bells began to toll, their frequencies matching perfectly with both the sacred geometry and the market algorithms displayed on the screens. Past and future, faith and reason, heaven and earth, all unified in a single eternal moment of understanding. Calixta Renshaw's transformation from skeptic to spiritual mathematician inspired a global movement. Today, the Cathedral of Sacred Light stands as a living bridge between faith and reason, reminding us that some truths transcend time itself, waiting patiently for each soul to remember them in its own way. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.